The clock on Kendrick Robinson's dashboard glared 8:42 a.m. as he swung his car into the cracked, sun-baked lot outside the Greenville Municipal Courthouse. The warm South Carolina morning wrapped him in a suffocating embrace as he killed the engine and sat for a brief second, hands tightening around the steering wheel. He hated being late, hated it with every disciplined fiber of his being. As a seasoned federal prosecutor, his world revolved around precision, preparedness, and respect for the law. But today had spiraled out of his control. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. Just a simple hearing to challenge an outrageous property tax adjustment on the house his late grandmother had left him, the home where he'd learned right from wrong under her watchful eye. A place that wasn't just bricks and beams, but a living, breathing vessel of his childhood. He had spent weeks meticulously gathering every document, every photograph, every scrap of evidence to prove the city's mistake. He was ready, or so he thought. The urgent call that derailed his morning came just as he was heading out the door, a last-minute motion filed in a high-stakes federal human trafficking case he was leading. There was no choice. Lives hung in the balance. He answered the call, reviewed the motion with rapid precision, fired back a response, and raced out, his heart hammering against the seconds slipping away. Now, standing outside the courthouse, Kendrick took a deep breath, adjusting the cuffs of his dark navy suit. He looked every inch the formidable attorney he was, yet inside, a storm raged. He knew the Greenville judge had a reputation, tough on latecomers, intolerant of excuses. But Kendrick had faced tougher adversaries than tardy reputations. He clutched his briefcase tighter and made his way to the courthouse steps. As he entered, the stale scent of old paper and burnt coffee wrapped around him. The worn beige walls and scuffed seats seemed to whisper of 1,000 small dramas unfolding within these walls. Parking tickets contested, landlord disputes fought, petty grievances aired. This was not the gleaming federal courtrooms Kendrick was used to. Here the stakes were lower, but the tensions just as real. He checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare. Barely enough. His shoes echoed down the narrow, crowded hallway as he followed the faded signs, heart pounding in rhythm with every step. Room 204, Judge Charles Whitman. Steeling himself, Kendrick adjusted his tie, pushed open the door, and stepped into a room already thick with nerves and anticipation. A wave of heat prickled his skin, not from the temperature, but from the unspoken pressure that clung to the walls. He found a seat near the back, flipping open his folder, scanning, preparing, calculating. He was here. He was ready. But as he would soon learn, the real battle that morning wasn't about taxes. It was about something far deeper and far more dangerous, a confrontation with an unseen, festering injustice that would change not just his day, but the course of his life. Kendrick sat rigidly in the back of the courtroom, his fingertips brushing the edge of his legal folder, but his mind no longer on the neat stacks of evidence within. Instead, his sharp prosecutor's instincts picked up the subtle tremors in the room, the ones most people missed. As the minutes ticked by, he watched latecomers drift into the courtroom. A middle-aged white man in a rumpled gray blazer slipped in unnoticed, his steps almost apologetic. No reaction from the judge. A young white woman in jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt slid into a seat near the front, pulling out her phone. No reprimand, no gavel, no contemptuous glare. But when Kendrick's name echoed from the bailiff's mouth and he rose to approach the bench, it was as if the entire atmosphere shifted. Judge Charles Whitman's piercing blue eyes zeroed in on him with surgical precision, his expression turning hard, almost disdainful. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge barked, the words slicing through the room like a whip. The tension that filled the courtroom was sudden and electric. Heads turned, papers rustled, eyes widened. Kendrick raised his hand slightly, a calm gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was addressing urgent matters regarding a federal human trafficking case." "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," Judge Whitman snapped, cutting him off. "This court operates on order and respect. Jaff, you are fined $750 for contempt." The gavel cracked against the bench like a gunshot. Kendrick stood frozen for a split second, feeling the weight of 100 stares boring into his back. His jaw tightened, but his face remained an impassive mask. Years of courtroom battles had taught him control. And yet, the injustice of the moment burned under his skin like acid. He flicked his gaze briefly to the woman scrolling casually on her phone, to the man still thumbing nervously through his notes, both untouched, unchallenged. Their lateness had merited no fine, no rebuke. Only him. Only Kendrick. The message was clear. It wasn't just about being late. It was about who he was. He returned to his seat, muscles taut, heart thudding with a heavy, bitter realization. This wasn't negligence. It was a pattern he had seen too many times before, an invisible line that divided the room. One group was given the benefit of the doubt, forgiveness, casual indifference. The other was met with suspicion, disdain, punishment. But Kendrick Robinson wasn't a man who folded under unfairness. As he reopened his folder, he wasn't just reviewing tax documents anymore. His pen moved swiftly across a blank page, recording every observation, every inconsistency, every subtle tell of a court that prided itself on justice, but stumbled blind over its own prejudices. The fine was steep, yes. The humiliation was sharp. But for Kendrick, it was something else too. A spark, a challenge, a call to action. Today was no longer about defending his grandmother's home. Today, Kendrick had stumbled into a deeper fight, and he wasn't going to walk away from it. The gavel's crack still echoed in Kendrick Robinson's ears as he sat motionless, the courtroom buzzing faintly around him. Every instinct screamed at him to stay silent, to swallow the slight and move on. But Kendrick was not built for silent suffering. Not anymore. Not after everything he had fought for. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat, feeling the subtle shift in the air as the spectators realized something was about to happen. He approached the podium again, his dark navy suit cutting a sharp figure against the faded beige of the courtroom. His steps were calm, his face unreadable, but inside a storm of purpose brewed. "Your Honor," Kendrick began, his voice even but ringing with a quiet authority, "with respect, I request clarification." Judge Whitman's cold blue gaze fixed on him, his jaw tightening. "Clarification, Mr. Robinson?" he sneered. "On what grounds?" Kendrick didn't flinch. "On the grounds of fairness. I noticed that other individuals who arrived after proceedings began were neither fined nor reprimanded. I simply ask, are the rules of this courtroom applied equally to all?" A collective gasp rippled through the room like a wave crashing against stone. The young woman with the phone looked up, startled. The man in the gray blazer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the bailiff froze, his hand tightening slightly on his belt. Judge Whitman's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. He gripped the arms of his chair as if bracing himself. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson?" he said, voice low and dangerous. "I am asking for clarity," Kendrick answered steadily, "because respect for this court demands that its rules be enforced without bias." The silence was thick enough to choke on. Kendrick could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, every heart pounding just a little harder. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was giving voice to every silent injustice that had gone unchallenged in this courtroom. Judge Whitman slammed the gavel down again, the sound sharper, more desperate this time. "Your fine stands. Further outbursts will result in additional penalties." Kendrick gave a slight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, but not surrender. He gathered his folder, turned, and walked back to his seat with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't beaten. He was taking notes, taking names, taking the first steps in a battle that would stretch far beyond the four-worn walls of this courthouse. As he sat, he caught the eye of an older black man seated a few rows ahead, a man who offered him the slightest, most solemn nod of solidarity. It was all Kendrick needed. The fight was no longer just about his grandmother's house. It was about exposing something that had been festering in the quiet corners of power for far too long. And Kendrick Robinson had just drawn the first line in the sand. The courthouse doors swung shut behind Kendrick Robinson with a heavy, echoing thud, but the injustice of what had happened inside clung to him like a second skin. He didn't even glance back. His polished shoes hit the pavement with sharp, deliberate steps as he crossed the lot to his car, each stride fueled by a rising fire in his chest. He had been wronged, not by accident, not by oversight, but by a system too comfortable in its quiet biases. And Kendrick Robinson was not the kind of man to let that go unanswered. Sliding into the driver's seat, He yanked open his briefcase and pulled out his phone. For a long moment, he stared at the contact list glowing on the screen. His assistant, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office, allies who trusted his instincts. He hovered over the call button, then stopped. No, not yet. This wasn't a complaint to file out of anger. This needed to be meticulous, documented, unassailable. He pulled out a yellow legal pad instead, flipped to a clean page, and began writing. Every detail, every discrepancy, every moment that screamed louder than the gavel's slam. The white man who arrived late and faced no rebuke, the young woman tapping away on her phone without a glance from the bench, and then the public humiliation reserved for him alone. By the time Kendrick returned to his apartment hours later, the sun was low, casting long doubt, bruised shadows across the city. But Kendrick wasn't interested in rest. He sat at his kitchen table, stacks of case law and court rulings piled high, scouring precedent after precedent. He needed to know the contours of the battlefield before stepping into it. The deeper he dug, the darker the picture became. Patterns emerged, not just from his own experience, but from whispers in the legal community that suddenly sharpened into alarming clarity. Stories of excessive fines, of dismissive treatment toward minority defendants, of small injustices that added up to a towering wall of inequality, right here in Greenville's municipal court. Kendrick drafted an internal report, cold and clinical on the surface, but beneath every word burned the truth. His documentation was precise, names, dates, observable disparities, but it wasn't enough to just write it down. He needed allies, proof that could not be denied. He began making discreet calls. A defense attorney he trusted, a paralegal who once confided her misgivings about courtroom procedures. Slowly, carefully, Kendrick built a network of witnesses, people who had seen the same things but lacked the power or the courage to speak. Each conversation added another brick to his growing case, another thread woven into the tapestry of systemic rot he was determined to expose. He knew what he was risking. A federal prosecutor challenging a sitting judge? It wasn't just career suicide, it was personal war. But Kendrick had stared down traffickers, corruption, and hardened criminals. He would not flinch now. As he compiled his findings into a dossier thicker and thicker by the hour, one thought pulsed through Kendrick's mind with grim certainty. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It never had been. And Kendrick Robinson was ready to bring the whole truth into the light, no matter how deep or ugly it ran. The first cracks in the facade came quietly, an anonymous email here, a whispered conversation there. But Kendrick Robinson knew the sound of a crumbling wall when he heard it, and in Greenville, that wall was finally beginning to shake. It started with Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, an older woman with kind eyes and a nervous twitch in her hands. One afternoon, in the privacy of a quiet corner outside the courthouse, she handed Kendrick a small, battered notebook. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I kept records," she whispered, "for years. I didn't know what else to do." Inside the notebook were dates, names, infractions, and outcomes, page after page meticulously documenting the disparities Kendrick had suspected. Minor infractions punished severely for black defendants. White defendants facing similar charges let off with slaps on the wrist or nothing at all. Kendrick turned the pages slowly, the weight of her quiet courage sinking into him. This wasn't just anecdotal. This was evidence. Real, raw, unignorable. From there, the dam broke. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff, finally spoke up after 15 years of silent witness. He gave his statement to the Judicial Review Commission, his voice low but steady. "I saw it every day," he admitted. The judge was harsher, quicker to punish, depending on who was standing at that podium. Soon, attorneys who had practiced in Judge Whitman's courtroom began stepping forward. Some were cautious, their words laced with fear of professional backlash. Others came with defiant answers pouring out, of clients reprimanded for daring to speak, of motions dismissed without cause, of punishments wildly disproportionate. Kendrick meticulously gathered it all, compiling charts, transcripts, affidavits. The pattern was devastating. Black defendants were fined 3 times more often for the same infractions. Requests for payment plans were denied disproportionately. Late arrivals by white defendants were ignored. For black defendants, they became a public spectacle of shame. The Judicial Review Commission investigators descended on the courthouse, sifting through years of dusty records. What they found mirrored Kendrick's findings, a judicial system that had quietly, methodically carved lines of privilege and prejudice into every ruling. Meanwhile, the story refused to stay hidden. A young law student who had witnessed Kendrick's initial clash with Judge Whitman posted her account online. Within hours, it went viral. Local news stations picked it up, followed by regional outlets. Then, national headlines blazed across television screens and news feeds. Federal prosecutor uncovers systemic bias in Greenville courtroom. Justice unequal, a judge under fire. Outrage erupted. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs stark against the pale stone walls. Justice should be blind. End courtroom bias now. We see you. Inside his modest office, Kendrick watched the tidal wave grow. His phone buzzed nonstop. Messages of support, offers of help, more stories from people he'd never met but who recognized the same bruises on their dignity. For a moment, he allowed himself a breath, a small, fleeting moment of vindication. But Kendrick knew this was only the beginning. The evidence was out now. The truth had cracked the silence wide open, and there would be no turning back. The walls of Judge Charles Whitman's courtroom, once symbols of silent authority, now seemed to tremble under the weight of a truth too heavy to contain. Day after day, the headlines grew louder, the crowds outside thicker. Protesters camped on the courthouse steps, their voices rising with a righteous fury that refused to be ignored. Signs reading "Justice isn't selective" and "Accountability now" swayed under the unforgiving South Carolina sun. Inside, Whitman tried to maintain an air of control, but even the seasoned judge couldn't ignore the cracks splintering around him. Rumors flooded the hallways, closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees, whispered warnings from longtime colleagues, even hints that other judges were quietly distancing themselves from him. The once-feared authority now looked small. Kendrick Robinson watched it all unfold from a careful distance. He didn't gloat. He didn't grandstand. He worked, quietly, relentlessly. Every day, more evidence surfaced, records, testimonies, statistics too damning to explain away. Kendrick's dossier grew until it was a mountain that no one, not even Whitman himself, could scale or dismiss. When the preliminary report from the Judicial Review Commission leaked to the public, it hit the community like a thunderclap. The findings were brutal: systematic disparities in sentencing, racial bias in fine enforcement, unequal treatment toward defendants of color. The numbers didn't just suggest misconduct, they screamed it. In response, demands for Whitman's resignation erupted across every media platform. Editorials called for sweeping judicial reform. Advocacy groups organized candlelight vigils. Even members of the state legislature began to murmur about impeachment if Whitman refused to step down. The pressure was relentless, choking. Still, for days, Whitman clung stubbornly to his bench, issuing terse denials through his attorney. "I have always acted in accordance with the law," he claimed. "Any perceived bias is purely coincidental." But no one was buying it anymore. One morning, under the gray dawn sky, Whitman arrived at the courthouse through a side entrance, hoping to avoid the protesters. But even in the back alley, he couldn't escape the graffiti hastily sprayed across the stone wall. "We remember. We demand better." By week's end, Kendrick received the news he had been expecting, but refused to let himself hope for. A terse announcement flashed across his phone. Judge Charles Whitman announces his resignation, effective immediately. No apology, no admission of guilt, just a hollow statement about acting in the best interests of the community. Kendrick sat back in his chair, the words blurring for a moment as the gravity of it all washed over him. He thought about the faces: Mrs. Thompson with her trembling hands, James Wilson standing tall despite years of silence, the young law student who dared to speak out. They had all carried pieces of this victory. It wasn't justice yet, but it was a beginning. And as Kendrick closed his eyes for a brief, quiet moment, he allowed himself something rare in his line of work: the faint, rising pulse of hope. The walls of that old courtroom would never be the same again. When the news of Judge Whitman's resignation rippled across Greenville, it felt as if an invisible chain had finally snapped. For decades, the courthouse had stood as a quiet monument to an unequal system, its tired beige walls and scuffed floors bearing witness to stories of silent injustice. But now, the air smelled different, sharper, charged. The change that Kendrick Robinson had fought for with pen, voice, and unshakable resolve had begun to take root. Within weeks, a sweeping reform initiative was announced. It wasn't just words this time. It was action etched into policy. All municipal court staff, from judges to clerks to bailiffs, were now required to undergo mandatory bias and ethics training, led by civil rights experts who pulled no punches. No more excuses, no more blind eyes. For the first time in living memory, payment plans for court fines became standard practice instead of rare exceptions. A new oversight committee was established, comprised of legal scholars, community leaders, and even former defendants, to audit court decisions for patterns of discrimination. Their mandate was simple but powerful: shine a light where darkness had been allowed to fester. The courthouse itself transformed. What was once a cold, intimidating building now bore visible signs of change. Bilingual signs offering guidance to non-native speakers, brochures explaining defendants' rights, a newly staffed legal aid desk just inside the main entrance. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was undeniable progress. And at the center of this quiet revolution stood Kendrick Robinson. Though he refused the spotlight, others wouldn't let him fade into the background. Law schools invited him to speak about judicial ethics. Civil rights organizations asked for his advice on building systemic change. He accepted when he could, not for fame, but because he understood. Momentum only mattered if you kept pushing. One crisp morning, Kendrick found himself standing once again in the very courtroom where this journey had begun. But it wasn't the same room anymore. Gone was the heavy, oppressive tension that had once made the walls feel like they were closing in. In its place was something lighter, more open, a sense of cautious hope. The new presiding judge, a woman with a reputation for fairness and compassion, welcomed Kendrick to address a gathering of court staff and community members. As he stepped to the podium, he took a moment to look around. Faces old and young, black and white, skeptical and hopeful alike stared back at him. He cleared his throat, voice steady. "Justice," he said, "is not a static thing. It demands vigilance, it demands courage, and it demands that we hold not just our institutions accountable, but ourselves." The applause was quiet at first, then grew, hesitant hands finding strength like a fire carefully stoked into a blaze. Kendrick knew the work wasn't finished. The scars of the past couldn't be wiped clean with a few policies or speeches. But he also knew this: the walls of the courthouse were no longer silent, and neither was he. The name Kendrick Robinson once echoed quietly through legal circles as a respected federal prosecutor. Now it rang out across the nation as a symbol of something far greater: the undeniable proof that one voice, steady and fearless, could ignite a movement. Requests flooded in from across the country. Law schools begged him to guest lecture. Civil rights organizations invited him to keynote conferences. Journalists clamored for interviews. But Kendrick chose his steps carefully. Fame was never his goal. Justice was. Every podium he stood behind, every interview he granted, he treated as an opportunity, not to celebrate himself, but to remind people of the deeper truth. The system only changed when those inside it demanded better. In Greenville, the ripple effects were profound. Young attorneys, inspired by his stand, organized workshops on courtroom ethics. Law students who had once doubted their place in the profession now wrote to Kendrick, their words brimming with new purpose. A group of them even founded a civil rights clinic in his honor. Its mission clear and bold: to hold the scales of justice steady, especially when the world tries to tip them. One afternoon, after speaking at a university seminar titled "The Role of Conscience in the Courtroom," Kendrick was approached by a young black woman, barely 22, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Robinson," she said, clutching a notebook to her chest, "you showed me that the law isn't just about statutes and rules. It's about people. It's about standing up when it's hardest. You gave me a reason to believe I belong in this fight." Kendrick smiled, softly, humbly. In that moment, the years of frustration, the sleepless nights drafting reports, the cold stares from those who wanted him silent, it all felt worth it. He carried reminders of that journey everywhere he went. In his modest office, framed next to his federal prosecutor's badge, hung the $750 fine Judge Whitman had once slammed down in contempt. Below it, a simple plaque inscribed with words Kendrick lived by now. Change begins when silence ends. But Kendrick understood that being a symbol came with weight. Every speech, every interview wasn't just a retelling of what happened. It was a call to arms, a beacon to those still trapped under the weight of unseen injustices. He urged others to look closer, to listen harder, to act when it was easier to stay silent. In time, national organizations recognized his contributions. Awards came, plaques, trophies, certificates, but Kendrick always placed them behind his desk, not in front of it. Symbols were meaningless without continued action, and action was what mattered. From Chicago to Atlanta, from Los Angeles to small rural courthouses scattered across America, whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into investigations. Investigations turned into reforms, all sparked by one man in one courtroom who chose to say enough. And Kendrick Robinson, once just another figure in a Navy suit blending into the halls of justice, now stood as a towering reminder. One voice can crack stone. One stand can move mountains. And the fight for true justice was only just beginning. Months turned into seasons, and the winds of change that Kendrick Robinson had stirred in Greenville grew into powerful currents sweeping across the nation. What had begun as a quiet stand against a single injustice now radiated outward, reshaping not just one courtroom, but countless others long cloaked in silent inequity. In Greenville itself, the transformation was unmistakable. The courthouse, once a symbol of quiet fear for many, had become a place where dignity was no longer a privilege but a right. Payment plans for court fines became standard. Courtroom procedures were audited quarterly for fairness. And most significantly, a new judicial ethics center was established right inside the building Kendrick had once been humiliated in, a living testament to the power of resistance. Kendrick's influence, however, didn't end at the city limits. Inspired by his story, civil rights advocates across the country launched similar investigations. In Chicago, a young public defender unearthed systemic disparities in bail settings. In Atlanta, a coalition of attorneys challenged a pattern of disproportionately harsh sentencing against minorities. In Texas, a network of judges voluntarily underwent new training on implicit bias, citing Kendrick's case as the catalyst for their awakening. Everywhere he went, Kendrick was met with stories. Letters poured into his office by the hundreds, defendants thanking him for giving them a voice they thought they'd lost, lawyers reinvigorated with a sense of mission, citizens finally believing, perhaps for the first time, that the system could change. One letter, penned by a retired attorney from Alabama, struck Kendrick particularly hard. For years, I sat in courtrooms and watched the injustices you now fight against. I was silent when I should have spoken. Thank you for having the courage to do what I could not. He kept that letter tucked inside his briefcase, a private reminder that while change was never instant, it was contagious. The data spoke louder than words. Within a year, Greenville's municipal court showed a 40% decrease in racial disparities in sentencing and fines. Defendants reported feeling treated with more respect. Legal aid services flourished. Transparency became not a slogan, but a daily practice. And Kendrick's reach only grew. He began teaching seminars on ethics at a local law school where his students, many of them first-generation college graduates, hung onto his every word. After class, they would crowd around him, notebooks open, voices eager, asking, "How do we keep pushing?" Kendrick's answer was always the same: by refusing to look away, by refusing to stay silent, by remembering that justice isn't a gift, it's a fight. Some nights after long days of teaching, speaking, and pushing forward, Kendrick would sit alone in his office. On the wall behind him hung two images: the framed contempt fine that had started it all, and a photo of young law students standing under a banner that read, "Justice for all, not just for some." It was there in that quiet that Kendrick found his greatest peace, because he knew that the battle was far from over, but the movement had already begun, and now it had thousands of voices. In life, true change often begins not with grand gestures, but with one person choosing to stand up when it would be easier to stay silent. Kendrick Robinson's journey reminds us that dignity, fairness, and courage are not values confined to youth or ambition. They are timeless principles that call each of us, no matter our age. His story shows that injustice persists when good people look away, But it begins to crumble when even one person dares to speak the truth with calm strength. For those of us who have seen the world change through decades of struggle and progress, it is a powerful reminder. Our voices still matter. Our choices still ripple outward, whether in a courtroom, a community meeting, or a quiet moment of everyday life. Choosing to uphold fairness and compassion can shape the future for generations to come. Justice is not something handed down from authority. It is something built, day by day, through the courage of ordinary people willing to say, "This is not right, and we can be better." The fight for dignity never grows old, and neither does our ability to make a difference.